Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, the topic is the second part of our lecture of who really won the revolution, or the limits of the American Revolution. As always, take a moment, hit pause on the video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key words at the top. Now let's finish this lecture. Now we left off, we're discussing African Americans. And of course we discussed this to a good extent. Let's move on now to Native Americans. How did Native Americans fare during and after the Revolution? You gotta realize, a large chunk of the fighting occurred on Native American land. So yeah, fights were fought in the cities that were controlled essentially by, the colonists, obviously. But a large chunk of this fighting, these battles would take place on the frontier areas. It would take place a little further west. And it would take place on Native American land. And thus, Native Americans are forced to pick a side. Now, some Indian groups would support the colonists, the Americans. Most were pressured to do so. And usually these groups were what you would say were smaller, weaker groups. What I mean by that, they were weak in numbers. And therefore, they didn't have the strength to stand up to the Americans. So even though they will, and unfortunately, even though they will join the American side, some smaller tribes, after the war, as we will see going forward, they're going to be pretty much abandoned by the Americans after the war. Numerically, though, like African Americans, the largest number, the vast majority of Native Americans will join the British. Why? It's pretty simple. If the British win and you help them win, maybe you can cut a treaty. And you have to assume, because of the situation that was going on, that the British Parliament, the King, will take a more direct control or authoritative control over the colonies if they win. This may give Native Americans a chance at a better life. Maybe we can start a hard treaty and maybe they'll actually hold to it this time. Because the alternative is, if the Americans win, you know what's going to happen. They're going to continue to expand west. They're going to continue to do the same things they've been doing for the past almost 200 years. And thus, for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, Native Americans en masse chose the British side. Now, one of the most influential Indian warriors who joined a British alliance was an Iroquois leader by the name of Joseph Brant. Now, the Iroquois, of course, remember the Iroquois, the Five Nations in upstate New York. Now, he grew up and he matured in the 1760s. And he grew to understand, Brant did, that despite a strong trading alliance that the Iroquois had maintained for all these years with the colonists in New York region, and despite the fact there were close ties between the Mohawks with important colonies, important colonial leaders, he realized that the writing was on the wall. So despite economic ties, despite diplomatic ties, remember going back to that Covenant Chain Alliance? Despite these economic and these political ties, he sees the writing on the wall. He knows that with his rapidly growing white population, a victory over the British will only further encourage them to expand west onto Native American land. And so, at the age of 33 in 1775, again, before the war even starts, he sees the writing on the wall. He's smart. He actually sails to London to see what the King George, would offer the Iroquois for their support in the impending war, even though it's not been declared yet. Brant concludes that for his own people, for their life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the protection of their property, Native American independence could only be served by fighting against the independence-seeking colonists. Joseph Brant will carry his diplomatic message throughout the Iroquois in Ohio country. and he will become critical in bringing most of the Iroquois into the war on the British side. Brant himself will play a key role in driving thousands of American farmers from their fields in upstate New York and southern New York. He will be instrumental in pushing northern Pennsylvania farmers, virtually eliminating the New York and Pennsylvania backcountry. Why is this important? Because that was great grain growing areas. They're the ones who produce some of the most vast amounts of grain that were needed for supplies in the colonial war effort. And they were able to destroy the crops, cut off the supply lines of food to the troops. And so while several thousands of Indians will join the American side, again, these are usually ones who are weaker in number, smaller in number. And while after the war, some of these tribes would be rewarded initially by state governors, ultimately, the governors would do little to protect the tribes from these land-hungry Americans who were now well-equipped and battle-hardened, trained in military prowess in this post-war rush for land. And so in the end, much like the 7 Years' War, the Indians were disastrous losers of the war, despite the exploits of Joseph Brant. Despite he fought for the losing side, just like the French in the French-Indian War, they fought for the losing side. And so by the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, despite a few loyal tribes who would be rewarded, ultimately the Indians as a whole are disastrous losers in the war. This was partly because they were far less successful than the 13 white tribes in overcoming intertribal and intertribal factionism. Also partly because the supply of European goods on which they depended, namely guns, gunpowder, they're gone. Because, remember, they need to trade with the American colonists to get the guns. They don't manufacture their own weapons. And once the British abandon the North, they're left, well, in trouble. And thus, you can see the map on your screen, facing a white society in 1783 Treaty of Paris that is now heavily armed, obsessed with this vision of the Western lands, nations like the Iroquois and the Cherokee are being forced to cede the vast amounts of their land. The American victory over the British was, quote, the greatest blow that could have been dealt us, unquote, said an Indian chief to the Spanish minister of St. Louis. So the Spanish governor of St. Louis was talking to an Indian chief in 1784, and the Indian chief tells him, quote, it was the greatest blow that could have been dealt us, unquote. Why? Because now they are the losers in the war again. They're a defeated foe, already seen as, well, savage, already seen as not quite human, lower on that racial social hierarchy, beneath the white people. They're viewed this way by these colonists. And now you have armed, trained men who, after the war, just want to expand and start a new life for themselves. So after the war, Americans began expanding west over the Appalachian Mountains. They violate the treaties. And basically, the state governments do little to nothing to help the Indians. Remember, the new United States is in debt, right? We talked about that at the end of the last lecture. We'll talk about it again in our next lecture. But one of the most valuable assets to the new nation is land, right? We are still an agricultural society. We have not hit the Industrial Revolution yet. And therefore, the most valuable asset to our new nation to make money and pay off our national debt, our state debt, our pensions for our soldiers, is more land. And where's the land come from? Native Americans. Now, could you argue that the Native Americans should have fought on behalf of the colonists, because obviously they would not have been a double loser then by siding with the losing side. And the answer is no. Because again, you know what's going to happen if they fought for the colonists. They're still going to be disregarded and pushed off their land anyway because they view Indians as lower on the social racial hierarchy. And thus, Indians become a disastrous loser, much like much like African Americans did with the Revolution. What about women? What about women? You see, the same challenge that natural rights posed over the issue of slavery, also they pose for the patriarchy and the widespread denial of rights regarding women. But instead, remember, in the case of enslaved Africans, there was some who said, oh yeah, all men created equal. Yep. They all got hung up on that word men, though. Because instead of there being a general recognition of the contradiction that is inherently in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, some would recognize that maybe should apply to Africans as well. But no one seriously thought that should be applied to women as well. They took that word men very seriously. And thus, most American males believe that women's subjection to the patriarchy of men was a matter of natural law and therefore legitimate. Remember, they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But does it apply to women? And many women agree with this also, but the men in large, the patriarchy that existed, never seriously considered that this should apply to women as well. They said, no. Women are naturally inherently different and therefore lower. Now, I would argue always that yes, there is differences. But different does not mean lesser. Different does not mean you should be put on a racial hierarchy or a sexual hierarchy, a gender hierarchy. But they believed it was natural law, God, divine providence. It was in the Bible. Why not? And thus, they never seriously considered the fact that women should be treated as equal as well and have the same pursuit of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And therefore, whenever this contradiction was explicitly asserted, most still denied the need to extend full equality and citizenship rights to women, arguing that men were naturally the best guardians and custodians of women. God, they agreed, had appointed the domestic role for women, beginning with childbearing. Women belonged to what was called the private sphere, in the home, raising the children, and men belonged in the public sphere, running the government, running business while they are away from home. In other words, men spend all day away from home conversing with others. Women are stuck in the private sphere, in the home, and really their only social escape came through church. And as a result, big surprise, the majority of churchgoers are women. It provided social and emotional relief. Think about life as a colonial woman. Picture yourself. Because the reality is, you all who are listening to this video are pretty much the age in which you would be getting married. And if you didn't get married, you'd be considered, well, a spinster. And so here's the life of a colonial woman. Right around 15, 16 years old, you need to get married. Now, remember, you are married in your teens. There is no chance for divorce. No. Now, your husband may divorce you, but you have no alternative. You have no option for divorce. You will spend your next 20 years having and raising children, giving birth every other year while you are stuck in the home raising those children. And remember, there is no birth control. The only birth control is abstinence, and that's not happening. Therefore, the nature of women's work is never ending. You must have the babies every year, make sure you are breastfeeding. You need to raise and produce your own food. Remember, men are not producing the food. They're not growing crops to sell. They're going to business to sell. They're not producing their own food. There's no electricity, so therefore you need to produce it every single day and no storage. You also need to make your own clothing. You have to go out to the sheep, you have to shear it, take the flax seed from the plants, you have to move that into thread, you have to physically make your own clothes for your family. You also must hand wash it. Yes, there's no washing machine. Men do work hard, not saying they don't, but they have more opportunities for relief while women are stuck either in the home or at church. And even though it is women who ultimately do run things in the private sphere, men have the ultimate control in both public and private spheres. And thus, the revolution is an opportunity for women to expand that private sphere role. First and foremost, in the military. Now, if you examine the military solely from the vantage point of Central Command, i.e., George Washington, the women and children will be invisible in the discussion. But if you instead turn your gaze to the vantage point of a foot soldier, an infantryman, thousands of women will appear. Why? Because thousands of women follow the troops and emphasize their support of the army. This is both sides, both the British and the American side, but far more on the American side just because it's their homeland. From the women's perspective, though, the American army is far less professional looking and far more disorganized. And the reality is, women were drawn into the task of direct military assistance and resistance to a far greater extent than we have truly ever appreciated. As they had since the 16th century, thousands of women and children traveled with the armies. They followed almost like groupies, but they didn't just watch. They served as nurses, laundresses, cooks. And yes, they were groupies and, of course, prostitutes. They made themselves useful wherever they could. And yes, that might mean for pleasure, but far more often it was about necessity. Someone had to wash the uniforms. Someone had to cook. Someone had to take care of the men on the battlefield. And yes, occasionally they could be seen hauling water for the teams that fired the cannons. They were also bringing food to men who were under fire. Patriotic women defended the Republic. They helped to win the war. They performed regular domestic duties, again, like cooking and sewing. Some would act as spies, either by walking through town. Some might even use their position as a woman to engage in pillow talk with British military men and get secrets and act as spies. Others, again, carried water. You see the picture that some women would actually engage in fighting. Those are few and far between, direct fighting. But there was also a use for women that no one usually thinks of. Once the men start falling on the battlefield, they fall with their weapons beside them and their ammunition. And one thing that armies always lack is ammunition and weapons. They would often send the women onto the battlefield to retrieve the weapons from the dead bodies. Why? Because, especially back then, there was something chivalry, patriarchy, yes, but you don't want to be seen shooting a woman. That's just bad form. That's unchivalrous. And so, if you're an American woman helping the military out, you were sent on the battlefield to retrieve weapons knowing that they're not going to aim and shoot at you. And the colonists use this to their advantage. And the reality is, women were present and traveled in the military. Again, all over the world. Most militaries in the world had a ratio of 10 to 1. In other words, 10 men to 1 woman. Now, the Continental Army was 15 to 1. Why? Because the women in the Army made General George Washington uncomfortable. Now, before we think he's just being sexist, it's more he has good reason to view women with skepticism. Yes, they did some needed things like processed food, supplies, cooking, cleaning, sewing. That's great. But they were also a drain on supplies because they have to be fed and clothed themselves. And thus, this army who never had enough supplies, never had enough uniform, never had enough ammunition, never had enough food, this was a big problem. And even for the most respectable women, being next to the army in a situation of 15 to 1, men to women, posed a moral challenge. And it embodies an alternate loyalty as well. So there's a morality issue here, right? So are they prostitutes? I mean, is a respectable woman want to be seen hanging around 15 men constantly? What are they going to say about her in town? So respectable women have an issue with their, well, reputations. Additionally, women pose an alternate loyalty to family or a lover. So what if a young soldier falls in love with this woman? Does a soldier now stay and fight for General Washington and for patriotism in his country? Or does he go off and leave the army, abandon the military for his new lover? Same thing for a mother. Will she cause her children to abandon the army? This could be a big challenge for a group like George Washington's men who are constantly facing desertion. That's in the military. What about outside the military? Well, the reality is women played a vital role in the military, but they also play a central role in the patriotic effort to transform political culture outside the military. Remember those economic boycotts we talked about with the Townsend Acts, ultimately with the coercive acts? Yeah, someone has to make up those products in the home, and that falls upon the women. You don't see George Washington or Thomas Jefferson going home and sewing more clothes because they can no longer buy it from the store. That's the women's job. And so even though these consumer boycotts are devised by men, it is women who are the ones who implement them and actually make them work and succeed. Again, women deserve far more credit to the success of the repeal of the Townsend Acts and ultimately the push to end the coercive acts. Women voluntarily do this out of patriotic duty. In addition, during the war, they will have expanded duties outside the home because they became what became known as deputy husbands. Because remember, their role was the private sphere in the home, but their husbands had a business outside of that. Maybe it was a plantation, right? And so once the husband goes off to war along with the older sons, who's going to take care of the family business and keep the home afloat? Who's going to hire and fire employees? Who's going to possibly have to reprimand, buy or sell enslaved Africans? That falls on the women. And this term is known as deputy husbands. They become deputy husbands and step in to fulfill the role of the husbands while still maintaining their role in the private sphere, raising the rest of the family still at home, taking care of the household, making the food, making the clothes, keeping the farm or business afloat. They become making all the decisions while the men are off at war. Which is important because even once the war is over, you got to rebuild your country, but it's a whole lot easier if your business is still there, if your land is still working, and you still have workers that are working it. Again, very important. Now, once the war ends, there will be a handful of women, usually elite and educated, who will begin arguing that women need more. And they'll begin arguing specifically for women's suffrage, the right to vote. Many women in general do want recognition for their sacrifices. They want recognition for their role in the revolution. They want an expanded role in society, expanded rights. They do want life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness for them as well. And one of the ways they pursue that is the idea of women's suffrage. And as you can see the quote in the bottom, I love this quote by Abigail Adams. Now, Abigail Adams becomes a leading women's rights person, and she also becomes the First Lady of the United States when her husband John Adams becomes president following George Washington. But I love this quote, and I pay particular attention to the last part of this. So, do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. In if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any law in which we have no voice or representation. This is radical. Now, this is radical. And she's using the very same words that our founding fathers used when citing the need for the Declaration of Independence. They're saying, hey, if you men are the ones forming these laws without our input, without our representation, we have no voice, then we are also duty bound, as you were, to cause rebellion. Now, in the end, of course, both sides will kind of calm down. There will be no major, obviously, war outbreak over this, but women will, especially elite women, will try to carve out a new identity for women, even though they will lose and never gain the right to vote during this, well, next century. Abigail Adams becomes the leader of this movement for expanded, not only calls for suffrage, but expanded rules for women. And what she helps develop is the idea, the concept known as Republican motherhood. Now, what is Republican motherhood? Well, the idea was, in the early years of the new republic, the United States, middle and upper class women generally asserted a role for themselves in the republic that stressed their worthiness, that stressed their responsibility to maintain the moral and ethical values that our country needs. In other words, they're seizing on the idea of civic virtue. Women made it their own. They claim civic virtue for themselves. So what does this mean? Remember, what is a woman's primary role in life in the 1800s? Raising children. So in this new republic, we need men who are going to be leaders, who are ingrained and instilled in them to live by these Republican ideals that the founding fathers fought and died for. Who better to teach the sons than the women who are raising them, the mothers? And they will teach their sons to be moral, to teach them to have high Republican ideals that will uphold the standard of the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution. They will teach their daughters to be moral and virtuous. They, in turn, when the daughters become of age and start giving birth, that those daughters will then teach their sons to be good Republican moral men. Women take on this role of morality and virtue. It was a private psychological stance that was laden with political overtones. It was a private psychological stance that women said, no, we are not mere homemakers. We are the ones who will educate morality and virtue to make sure this country will endure. It was psychological, yes, but it's a tremendous political slant to it. Because remember, they're raising the next generation of political leaders. So while women are denied the one true marker of citizenship, voting, they will argue they will still be incredibly important to this new nation, as they must train the next generation of leaders. So, how do we conclude this? In studying the American Revolution, we need to broaden our perspective. And we're recognizing that this conflict, fought by white Americans for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, compelled most non-white Americans to fight for the British, to fight on the British side in quest of their own same goals: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The Native Americans and African Americans were animated by the doctrine of natural rights. As surely as the Minutemen of Concord in Lexington or the signers of the Declaration of Independence, they believed it wholeheartedly. They knew what it meant to have natural rights. And they were as moved and motivated by self-interest as the white revolutionaries. However, for the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, African Americans and Native Americans took to the other side to preserve and or gain those rights, which had been denied by the white colonists. In their struggle against the white revolutionaries, most of them lost, at least in the proximate sense. Their colonial experience would not be over when America overthrew the colonial masters. Let me repeat that. For Native Americans and African Americans, their colonial experience, where they are being dominated by an outside foe or an outside presence. Remember, the American Revolution for the colonies was fought against the tyranny of Great Britain. Because they were colonies, they were being ruled by a tyrant over in England. For Native Americans and African Americans, this would continue after 1783. They would still be in the role of being essentially colonized by these white Americans. And therefore, for African Americans, the revolution had paradoxical results. It produced an ideology that decried slavery, all men created equal. It did generate some efforts to end the slave trade. It marked the first general debate over abolition. Yet slavery was only eradicated where it was least important, in the North. While in the South, where slavery had its strongest hold, the future was guaranteed that slavery would remain. In spite of the political fervent generated by the revolution, women reaped very few clear advantages. Though they would participate in many revolutionary crowds and achieved enhanced status as Republican mothers, they were still denied the right to vote, that critical index of full Republican citizenship. And Native Americans? Well, we'll discuss them in far more detail as we go forward. But short answer, they're just killed and pushed off their land, never being accepted as equals or a part of the American nation. So who really won the revolution? Well, the United States did. But there are some important limits to discuss. In other words, if you were not someone who had property, was white, and was a male, did you ever get to pursue your life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? Something to contemplate and consider as we move forward into our next lecture on how do we form a new nation. But that's for next time. So for now, take care. Until next time, bye-bye.